Great, thanks Mimi. And hi everyone, welcome. I'm Brent Evans, new assistant professor here in LPO. And the topic of my talk is persistence patterns in MOOCs, massive open online courses. And this is collaborative work with several scholars at Stanford. I started this project while I was a PhD student at Stanford last year, and now we're finishing up at least the first part of it. Tom D is an economist at the Center for Education Policy Analysis at the Education School at Stanford, and Rachel Baker and Erica Greenberg are advanced doctoral students at Stanford as well. So what are we talking about here? Today's goals are fourfold. So first of all, I want to just share with you kind of this, what I think is very cool data that we have, and give you some examples of the types of analyses that we can do with it. And then present what I think are some previously unknown stylized facts about MOOCs. A lot of what we know about MOOCs is just kind of present in the media. They're about one course here, one course there. So we're trying to actually compile a lot of data and bring some facts to the general public. And then focus predominantly on persistence patterns. And we'll debate kind of what persistence in a MOOC really means and why that's even important. But there's a lot of different ways that we can look at persistence. We look at it at the course level, at the lecture level, and at the student level. And we've got covariates for all of those. And then I want to describe a behavioral economics style experiments that we conducted in a MOOC in an effort to increase persistence. And as a preview, it didn't work at all. So don't look forward to that part of the talk. All right, so developing a research agenda is, I think, a main goal of a lot of people right now in this MOOC field. We don't really know a lot from an academic perspective, and there are a billion questions to answer. So I'm sure people will make their whole careers on this. We are still in the exploratory phase and trying to understand what we can do with the data that we have, what are the really interesting questions. So toward that end, there are potential for tons of different papers, and I would love your ideas. So feel free to interrupt me with questions, comments, ideas. We can generate some paper ideas and start working on them, and that would be great. So let's make this as collaborative as we possibly can be. So if there are interesting data that you think I don't have that we might be able to acquire, suggestions for that would be great, new analyses to conduct, or other interesting questions that we so far have overlooked. So what are massive open online courses, and what are they all about? Well, there are dozens of platforms that offer MOOCs all over the world. You may not be aware of that. The big three in the United States are Coursera and edX and Udacity, and those are the ones that have gotten the most press recently. But there's actually dozens of different platforms for MOOCs. So we hear a lot about these, and these are definitely the big ones in the United States. There's over 5 million students are enrolled in Coursera, over 1 million on edX. There's over 100 partner institutions with Coursera. Most of them are all elite colleges from across the globe. And part of what makes edX and Coursera and Udacity big deals is because they're these really elite universities offering their material with their professors. And so what does it mean to partner with one of these platforms? Well, it basically means you have a faculty member who is developing the class and delivering it with the resources of the university in partnership with one of the platforms. There's over 400 courses on Coursera, about 100 on edX, 30 on Udacity, covering a wide range of fields. So just to give you some example, actually, how many of you have taken a MOOC or enrolled in a MOOC? Actually, a good number of you. All right, how many of you have finished a MOOC? All right, few less. OK, but still a couple. That's good. So for those of you, what's definitely. So I thought I would just throw up some slides of screenshots of various MOOCs. OK, so this one is from Coursera, and you can see just a ton of different classes that are available. So there's data structures and algorithms. I don't know what that is. Anyone help me out? Chinese? No? OK. 21st century American foreign policy, the stuff on global warming, stuff about education, the Common Core in action. So a lot of them are STEM related, but certainly not all of them. And there's actually quite a bit. You can find humanities classes. You can find social science classes. I took, although I dropped out of it, a class on science fiction and fantasy literature from the University of Michigan. So there's just all sorts of ways that we're trying to figure out how to deliver different types of information. This one is from Udacity. One of the nice things about Udacity is that it has categorized them into beginner, intermediate, and advanced courses. So you have some sense of what the prerequisites might be when you're jumping in if you're new to the topic. Here's one from edX. The first three here are from Harvard's. This one's from Berkeley. Again, these are some poetry in early New England. I mean, you have all sorts of different courses that are available to you across the range of subject areas. Once you go a little bit deeper and you actually enroll and register for a course, you get something like this. This is the first week's lectures for a course called Big Data in Education, taught out of Teachers College. And you can see here that there are 6, 7, I guess, lectures. Over here, each of these is a document, like a handout that's associated with that lecture. You can download the lecture if you don't just want to watch it and stream it. And then over here, you actually see all the different components to the class. So one of the big ones is the video lectures, and that's what I focus on predominantly today. But there's also quizzes. And in this class on big data and education, there's data sets that you can pull down and conduct analyses on them. There's other supplemental materials the professor may post that are references, online textbooks are common posting there. And then the discussion forums, which enable you to go in and post a question, ask a question, post comments about questions. You can rate questions up and down. A lot of students just jump in and start reading the discussions. The discussion forums are intended to be a vibrant component, basically replicating the classroom environments in an online forum. Often in the courses, the professors will go in and read some of the discussions and participate as well. All right, so one question that people often initially ask is, are MOOCs really a new thing? Well, information is not, providing it freely, not a new concept, right? We have public libraries. iTunes U and YouTube had lectures that were online long before this MOOC thing exploded. MIT OpenCourseWare has been around for over a decade. So there are all these other ways that we've thought about distributing information. Also, distance learning isn't new, right? We've thought about distributing information from a long way away. And we've talked about hybrid classes. I mean, this goes way back to correspondence courses through the mail, hybrid programs that offer blended learning. You see a lot of professional programs and graduate programs in which students come to campus for a couple days a week. They go and do their work online, either synchronously or asynchronously. So there's all sorts of different types of distance learning. So what is new about MOOCs? Well, and my take on it is it's the packaging. That they've basically combined this free available information, structured it specifically for online learning to a wide array of people, and they've decided not to do it with any sort of attachment to credit thus far, although we're starting to see changes in that. They also are really thoughtful about integrating assignments in assessments and providing feedback to them. One of the really cool things that first happened to me in the first MOOC that I took, I was just casually watching the first lecture video, and then it paused and asked me a question in the browser, right? So there's formative assessment that's built into the actual lectures. You respond. If you don't get it, it gives you some hint, and then you go back and take it again. And if you respond correctly, then you move forward in the lecture. So there's those sorts of formative assessments, and then a bunch of summative assessments at the end. And then there's these large learning communities that are taking place in these discussion forums. And if there are tens of thousands of students in a course, which is true in many of these courses, you can get an answer to your question almost instantly by going and posting it on the discussion forum, because there's thousands of other people that are on there looking at them. It's also developed more local learning communities. And if you go onto a discussion forum on a new MOOC or the first week of the course, you'll actually see students saying, hey, I'm in Buenos Aires. Like, who else is taking this course from Buenos Aires? Let's get together and talk about this. And so there's a lot of actual tangible learning that's taking place in study groups, and people are actually getting together in the physical environment in their localities and meeting online. So that's what I think are some of the new things that MOOCs are trying to do. But the concept itself, not really new. We are starting to see MOOCs being considered for credit. So the American Council on Education this summer basically said, we think there's 5 or 6 courses on Coursera that colleges should consider offering credit for. And to the extent that institutions listen to ACE and their credit recommendations, this could have a lot of sway. So if they're saying, look, these are 5 or 6 courses that we think are really, really good, feel free to offer credit for them. So maybe there's an opportunity now for students to gain credit at an institution of higher education by taking a free online MOOC. Coursera introduced this concept of signature track because they were concerned about, well, how do I know it's really you sitting at the computer answering these questions and taking this MOOC? And so the signature track involves actually signing in every time you participate, and then there's a little web camera that actually watches you and makes sure it's you that's doing the work. The San Jose State made a big splash in the news when it partnered with Udacity last spring and basically decided to offer 3 MOOCs that would provide credit for remedial courses at San Jose State. And these were 3 remedial math courses. Students enrolled in the MOOC, they took the entire thing online, and they did horribly. So less than 50% passed in all 3 of the courses, and so San Jose State said, let's hold on, we're not sure we want to do this. They did actually replicate the study in the summer, and with the same 3 classes offered a second time, and then they also introduced a psych class and a CS 101 class. And students did a little better. In 4 of the 5 classes, about 2/3 of the students passed, but still, there's some concern over persistence rates, even when these things are offered for credit. Georgia Tech is partnering with Udacity to offer an online MOOC-only master's degree program from Georgia Tech in computer science for $6,600. It's starting in January. You can go pay Georgia Tech and get an online master's degree in computer science for $6,600 from Georgia Tech, which much, much less than it would cost you to go to Georgia Tech and actually get their master's degree in computer science. So there's a lot of explorations about whether or not we can provide this information in a MOOC format, charge people for it, and actually grant them a credential that is worth something. And even if you don't award official credit, there is a concept that they're providing completion certificates, and these certificates might actually be useful in the labor market. We don't know. No one has really looked at this. It's something that we're interested in exploring if we can figure out a good way to do it. Most of the MOOCs, if you complete all of the assignments with a certain percentage grade, you'll get a certificate of completion. And whether or not that means anything is unknown. Anecdotally, I think there's a lot of really advanced high school students who are trying to take these MOOCs, get certificates of completion from elite colleges, and then put it into their application to college and say, look, I can do Stanford-level coursework, so of course you should let me in, right? I've already shown I can be successful at that. So there is something about these certificates of completion that actually might be very valuable. Yes, Corbett.
I would add, one of our relatively recent alum is now a recruiter for computer engineers.
Ah.
And his field, they are following these online courses and seeing how people are doing on the leaderboard to identify candidates and to vet candidates. So.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. So these are serving as signals then in actual labor markets and have real outcomes. One of the things I want to do that I haven't looked at yet, are you all familiar with Odesk? Anyone know Odesk? It's this kind of way for computer programmers to find contract work. So, you might be sitting in Russia, but you're like a really good computer programmer, and you're in the middle of Siberia, and you don't have any employment opportunity there. But you can basically hire yourself out to people that need computer programs written. And so some company says, we need this program written in this software. Here's what it has to do. We'll pay somebody $20,000 to do it. Or they take bids, and people go and bid on it, and they give their qualifications. Well, I'm wondering if some of these MOOC certificates are popping up and things like that. Like, hey, I've got a certificate in cryptography from Stanford, so maybe you want to hire me. So that's just one thought that I have in terms of seeing if these have any value in the labor market, but open to other suggestions on that front. Thanks, Corbett. Okay, so previous literature on MOOCs. This is really, really a nascent field, right? We have very few academic studies. Most of what we read about this are in the media, in blogs. Just to give you a sense of this, not that Wikipedia is ever a good benchmark of academic work, but if you go and you look at the Wikipedia page on MOOCs, which is really, it's pretty good, there's like 145 citations, and I bet 90% of them are from the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and blogs. So that's really where people are getting their information from, not from academic papers. Although there is some academic work being done, mostly it's in the field of learning analytics. So the learning scientists are really, really thrilled about this MOOC stuff because it's an opportunity to sort of open the black box of the human mind as they're learning and follow people as they click by click learn in a course, right? We understand when they're watching the videos, when they pause the videos, what they're doing in answering these formative assessments, whether or not the hints that they get are helping, how they're doing in the summative assessments in every single question. And so a lot of the learning sciences people are really excited about using big data to understand how people learn through these MOOCs. I'm not qualified to comment on that because I know nothing about learning sciences, and I've been approaching this much more from a higher ed policy perspective. People are claiming this could revolutionize higher education, right? We haven't seen that happen yet. Certainly a bunch of people are jumping on the bandwagon, and I'm interested in thinking through the implications of this. Are we going to start seeing people that are taking MOOCs in lieu of actually attending traditional higher education, especially if we start offering them for credit? So towards that end, I'm interested in persistence. And we have a lot of anecdotal or single course estimates of what the completion percentages of these are. And they're awful, right? You hear in the media that like 7% of the students that registered actually got a degree, or 10%. And that's about right. I'll show you some of the data for that. But that brings up big questions is, well, should we expect anything higher? These are not necessarily all students who are enrolled in a traditional college class. So one of the contributions that this paper is trying to make is giving you a broad number of classes to look at the difference in persistence patterns. These are three of my colleagues at Stanford that are graduate students in three different disciplines, in communications and computer science and education. And so I just like to make this point that it's one of, MOOCs are like this really great way to bring interdisciplinary studies together because there are people studying a lot of different things that can come together and talk about this. So this is one of the early, I think, best papers in the academic world on MOOCs. They look at three computer science classes at Stanford. And they focus on identifying the patterns of enrollment and completion. And they identify four types of students. So the first is completers, the people that are engaged the entire way through for the full length of the course, and they get a certificate at the end. The second they call auditors. These are people that are watching the videos but not completing the assignments, but they watch the videos mostly up until the end of the course. And that's kind of equivalent to the traditional auditor in normal higher education. Then you have samplers. These are people that are coming in and watching a lecture or two, maybe trying their hand at an assignment, usually at the beginning of the course, but sometimes in the middle of the course, and then disappearing, and they never to be heard from again. And that's actually a large chunk of people that they just come in, see what it's like, think it's not for them, and they move on. And then there's the disengagers. And I've been guilty of falling into this category, where I've started a MOOC, I've been fully engaged for several weeks, watching all the lectures, completing all the assignments, and then I just get busy, it becomes less interesting, I've learned what I've gotten, what I've wanted out of it, and I just stop. And so you see these people that are very, very invested, and then they drop off and never to be heard from again as well. So this is an interesting way to think about who these people are and why they're taking these courses. So it's a useful starting point.
Brent, are the
Yeah. Sure.
modal category samplers or disengagers?
Samplers, I would say. Yep. I would have to go back and remember the exact percentage that they assign to each of these. But they're also looking at three of the early computer science MOOCs, right? And so there's some question as to if this pattern is true across all MOOCs. Yeah, sure, Stella.
For the learning analytics, I also, and I know much less than you do on this, but in measuring how time on task or when someone's paying attention, they're fully engaged, do they control for not checking your email while you're watching a MOOC, for having Internet Explorer on? Like, how is that? Do you know anything about that? Measured?
Yeah, that's not measured. So when we're looking at on people's lecture watching behavior, for instance, right? We basically capture they watched the lecture, they started watching the lecture at this time from this IP address, and then that's kind of what we know. So we don't know if they're like coming in and out of the room. Some of them are just downloading the video, and so we don't actually know when they're watching it. They're just downloading it. There have been other studies that look at kind of people's eyes, that you can use your webcam to sort of track people's eyes on their screen, which can speak to that a little bit. I don't know much about it, but I know that that exists. There is some work done on time on task is improved if the lectures are short. And so one of the things that you may have noticed, let me go back to it really quickly. If you look at this big data stuff, these lecture times are incredibly short. 6 minutes, 55 seconds, 9 minutes, 17 seconds, 10 minutes, 47, 9:52, 8:13, 10:23, right? So there's this idea that we should be delivering very short lectures so that students have the time to gather everything you're trying to say in 10 minutes. They can stop, they can go do something else, come back to the next lecture if they want. This is very different from the 3-hour seminar idea or the like hour-and-a-half lecture that we think of as kind of the traditional lecture. Does anyone else know more about the learning analytics side? Want to comment on that? Okay. Yeah, that I'm not claiming to be an expert in by any means. Okay, so why do I think persistence is important? I think this is a good question. One reason is because we're moving to this credit-based model. And so if we're moving towards a credit-based model, then we need to actually have people persisting to get the credit, or then it's not really all that worthwhile. I will also argue that even if we don't care about the credit, that learning only happens when you're participating, right? So if we think MOOCs are delivering all this information to people that wouldn't otherwise have it, well, they have to actually watch the lectures. They have to participate in the discussion forum. They have to take the assessments in order to actually learn anything. And so if they're not doing those things, then they're not learning anything, then that's just the same as having a book on the shelf in a library that never gets checked out. Like, it's not being used, no one's learning, what's the point? So I think that's why persistence is important. I also think it's a good first step in understanding whether or not this model could replace a proportion of higher education. So if it doesn't work, if students aren't engaged for all sorts of different reasons, then this isn't going to be a valid way to revolutionize higher ed, if we even think that that's necessary. So it's a first step in trying to understand what these persistence patterns are like, and I think it's important, although I could understand the disagreement with it. But I do, as a caveat, want to point out that the persistence patterns that we talk about in MOOCs are not a fair comparison to those of what we think of in traditional higher education, right? In traditional higher ed, students can add and drop courses. They can come in the first day, say, oh, this professor's not going to be good for me. I'm going to drop out of it. They can actually, they're paying money, and they're not actually paying money here. So maybe if students have some money invested in the class in traditional higher ed, they would have persisted. But because they're not investing anything other than their time here, it's very easy to stop. Registering is also ridiculously easy. So in Coursera, I can give them my email address, create an account, and then register for 400 classes by just clicking a button 400 times. So I could register for every single Coursera class in under 10 minutes, no problem. So what is registering signaling? It's a good question. Is it just say, oh, that looks interesting. OK, yeah, I'll register for it. And now I'll suddenly get some emails and have access to all the course materials. So we shouldn't think of students just registering as actually expressing more than, I think, a passing interest in the topic of the course. OK, yes, Angela.
You know, at Georgia Tech, how are they going to handle this with the, because they're going to charge tuition.
So they're going to charge, right. So I think this could be very different, right? It might get a completely different set of people that are taking these courses because they're actually paying for them. And
so they'll kind of pay by course, just like you might in a.
So I don't know if they're going to pay the sort of $6,600 up front, and now you get access to all of them, or if it's going to be a course-by-course thing. That's a good question. Yeah, should find that out.
They probably qualify for federal funding, the students do, so there's probably going to be some criteria determined by, federal loan criteria.
So right, yeah, I mean, they will get Title IV funding, right? So there's going to be some regulations that are.
Which will impact when they can charge.
Right, that's true. Yeah,
So
Dominique.
tuition fees are all due at the beginning of each semester, and they have to pay per credit hour $134, and then an additional fee of $301 per academic term.
There you go. Thank you. Isn't the internet wonderful? All right. Other questions at this point? OK. Yes, please.
You're not comparing other kinds of online learning. You're only doing MOOCs, right?
That's correct, yes. So there are lots of other formats in online learning. That's right. And I'm just looking at MOOCs. And I'm just looking at Coursera MOOCs even.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Georgia Tech, it's not a MOOC, I think. It's not open to an unlimited number of enrollments. I have a feeling they have a cap at like 500 or 1,000, and they're scaling it up to a number in a few years. That's what I read.
So yeah, my understanding is that they're doing it this pilot this first time with a small cap. So I think that's true. Although I think their intention is to make it as broad as possible. But yes, that is a good point. That's a little bit different. And it's on Udacity, which is a different platform as well. So thank you for kind of clarifying that for me. We have to be careful when we're talking about these things because there's a lot of different varieties and flavors of MOOCs and online learning in general. So yes, I don't think what I find would necessarily apply to that. Yeah, exactly. OK, so here's what I think our contributions are to this literature. I think this is the largest comprehensive study to date that I have found. It has 47 courses worth of data. But correct me if you all know of something that is larger. We're exploring predictors of persistence at the course, lecture, and student level, as I mentioned. We've got this experiment to increase persistence through a pre-commitment device, and I'll talk about kind of what that device is later on. And we're incorporating location data. And this location data is great because it enables us to figure out exactly where these students are in the world. It gives us kind of the local time at which they're watching this. It allows us to pull in demographic characteristics of the area and the region from which they're enrolling. Even though we don't actually know anything about them, right? We don't want to commit the ecological fallacy here. We can only learn about the area from which they're enrolling. But that enables some really interesting stuff. So what kind of data do we have? So our data is from Coursera. And we have a ton of different types of data. We've only started to explore parts of this. So the course level data tells us information such as when was the course offered, how long is the course, which iteration of the course is it. So a lot of courses have been offered 4, 5, 6 times at this point. We have lecture level data such as what's the title of the lecture, how long is the lecture, when was the lecture released. We have the lecture watching data, which is the actual student interaction with the lecture. So what IP address did they watch the lecture from? When did they start watching the lecture? Did they stream it? Did they download it? We have quiz and assignment data that has kind of when the quiz was released, how many questions are on it, what those questions are, the student's submission of that quiz and assignment data, so how they're doing on it, their grades, when they submitted it, when they did it. We have the discussion forum activity, literally like whatever they said on the discussion forum is captured. We have their course grade, whether they got a certificate, email announcements from the professors. Sometimes they would say, hey, look, I just released all of these courses, all of these lectures for week 3. Sometimes they would have comments on the assignments. Sometimes they would bring up other issues that they saw on the discussion forum and just send out a big email blast that discussed one of the problems that they saw. We have IP addresses and the time for each student-course interaction. So this is just an unbelievable amount of data. We predominantly have focused on this lecture watching data. We haven't really done anything with the quiz and assignment or discussion forum data yet, but that's something that could be to come. OK, so what courses are we looking at? Most of our courses are from Stanford, although we also have 5 courses from Penn and a course from the University of Florida. Here, you see in parentheses the number of those courses. So algorithms has been offered 3 times at Stanford. We have all 3 iterations of that, 7 times for cryptography. So a lot of this is STEM and computer science related, but we also have stuff like world music and startup. If that's not a Stanford course, I don't know what is. Introduction to Logic, CS 101. I should also point out that a couple of these are what they call self-study courses. The general idea in the MOOCs is that you are taking a class at the same time with everyone else that's taking it, and the class progresses week to week for, say, the 8 weeks of the course. But some of these courses they've offered as self-study, which basically means they put all of the lecture videos for all of the weeks and all of the quizzes up, and you just take it at your own pace. The downside of that is you don't have this learning community that you can actively participate in the discussion forums with. But the upside is you can take as long as you want. But they don't offer certificates of completion for those self-study models. OK. Last slide on data. So we have this geolocation data from the IP addresses. What this involves is we take the IP address and we match it to a latitude and longitude using the MaxMind GeoIP database. The accuracy of this is up for some debate, and it varies from country to country. They don't really tell you how specific it is as well. They'll tell you that it's about 90% accurate within 20 miles. So you get some sense of where people are, but it might not be as precise as you would like it to be. But it does give you the internet service provider, for instance, that's actually providing access, in addition to the latitude and longitude coordinates. So then we map those using GIS software, and then we can pull in other maps like demographic information from the census, stuff like that, that is of use and interest. Yes?
Just a question on the 3 universities that you use to pull courses from.
Sure.
Any logic associated with why you pick Penn and Florida as the other 2?
No, convenient sample. So it just happens to be the data that we have available to us at the time. Doug Fisher and I have been talking. We're trying to get the Vanderbilt data for the Vanderbilt MOOCs from Coursera. We've been trying to talk with Andrew Ho at Harvard to get the edX data. So there's a lot of conversations with data sharing going on in this world across many, many universities. There's a paper that I actually just saw for the first time yesterday out of the provost office at Penn, where they're looking at 32 Penn Coursera courses. And they basically did a demographic survey of the participants in those courses. So a lot of this just happens to be what's available to us. There have been a lot of conversations with other institutions about data sharing agreements. So there's one, I think, really famous course from the University of Edinburgh on basically taking care of your horse, like horse nutrition and care. It has like one of the highest completion rates of any MOOC I've seen. Like 40% of the students actually complete, probably because they have a horse and if they're taking it and they really want to learn about how to take care of it. So there's been some talk about trying to get that data just because it's an interesting course. So no, a lot of this is, we're still, like I said, in the early stages of compiling data, and there's no rhyme or reason why we have these courses.
One other question. I know you mentioned that some of the courses, I don't know if you said all the courses, were ones that were using the survey up front. The evidence that completing the survey increases the persistence. And
Yeah, so
one of the courses I took, and it had all these different test modules. I didn't know if all of them did.
no, very few of them do, actually. So I will present persistence for this one course in which we do have a pre-course survey. And you're absolutely right. The best predictor that I've seen of any predictor of completing the course is if you filled out the pre-course survey. So that's a preview of something to come. Some of these other courses did have pre-course surveys, but we don't have access to that data. We're trying to get it. Coursera has also tried to implement, they're developing a pre-course survey that they want to give across all Coursera courses across universities. Not sure if that's actually going to happen. Might be adopted on an institution-by-institution basis, but we're trying to work towards that. The problem with these surveys, though, is that the response rates are very low. OK, so a couple stylized facts about MOOC users. So first of all, where are MOOC users? So here's a nice, pretty map of the globe, and dots are covering North America almost entirely, and Europe entirely. You see India covered entirely, Eastern Asia, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, coasts of Australia, coast of South America. No one in Antarctica, but I don't know if IP addresses are actually mapped to Antarctica. I don't know if they have their own separate IP addresses, so there might be somebody in a research station that's IP addresses mapped elsewhere. But the point is, the globe is pretty much covered in terms of where these people are from. But it's much more sparse, say, in Africa, which you might expect. So if you just look across continents, 35% almost are coming from North America. Europe is close behind that. Asia close behind that. And then there's really not many people coming from Africa, from Oceania, from South America, comparatively. What about within the United States? So this last column here has all courses that we have across the 47. California is dominating. 25.2% of participants from the United States come from California. And then you see sort of New York, Texas. I mean, part of that makes sense because they're the biggest states, of course. But California is like way overrepresented, in large part because I think a lot of these things were sort of born in Silicon Valley, and that's where there's been a lot of news and press, and a lot of these things are coming out of Stanford. The interesting thing to note here is that when you look across the courses at Penn, at Stanford, and Florida, there's actually some regional association. So the Florida course has a lot more Florida people in it than the Penn courses and the Stanford course. Pennsylvania is much higher for the Penn courses than it is for the California courses or the University of Florida courses. I think this is sort of interesting. Like, this idea of MOOCs offering topics that are supposedly widely available still seems to be pulling in some regional people because probably the sway of the university, right? You're living in Pennsylvania, you hear that Penn's offering a course, you're like, oh, maybe I'm more interested in it, even if it's the exact same course that's being offered by Stanford elsewhere on another platform. So we're going to try to explore that a little bit more because I think that's of interest. It's also possible that the institutions are offering classes that would be useful for their local region, right? So the Florida class that we have is on sustainable agriculture. So maybe there's a bunch of like citrus farmers in Florida that want to learn about sustainable agriculture, and that's why it's more interesting to them than it would be to people from Pennsylvania. I don't know, just hypotheses at this point. All right, and then pulling in some of this demographic data from the IP addresses, we can start to look at what the composition of the regions from which MOOC users come and compare that to sort of national numbers. So what we've done here is provide the national average mean of communities, and the mean, you can think of this as sort of the mean MOOC person of all the people that we have and what their community looks like. Really what this is sort of a weighted average of the communities from which MOOC users are coming based on how many people from that community are enrolled in our sample. And when we're talking about community here, what we've done is basically taken this down to the census tract level. So census tract is about maybe 4,000 people or so on average in a census tract. And what we're looking at is the difference in racial composition, educational composition, labor force composition, and SES composition between the areas from which MOOC enrollees are coming and the national average. And what we see is that there's a higher percentage of Asian population in these areas, higher degrees, bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees, slightly lower unemployment rates. Now, again, we don't know who these users are, right? Every single person in our data set could be white, and we don't know that. So this only tells us the regions from which they're coming. But the regions from which they're coming are more likely to be Asian and more likely to have higher degrees, such as graduate degrees and bachelor's degrees, than other regions, and clearly not very impoverished relative to the national average. So comparing this is one measure that you could use to sort of think about what are the demographics of MOOC users. The advantage of this method is that we're capturing everybody as opposed to the survey method in which we're actually only capturing the people that respond to the survey. So there's this big response bias in the survey. But then again, the survey demographic data is actually asking who the individual users are, which in some ways is much more valuable than just knowing about the place that they're coming from. But in combination with some of the demographic survey data, I think we're starting to get a picture of where these people are coming from. One of the nice things about getting this ISP from the geocoding data set is that we know if they're logging in from a business or from a university or something like that. So we just started looking at the universities. The Indian Institutes of Technology are from India. There's like 16 of them, so this isn't really one university. But there's a lot of people in game theory and algorithms, machine learning from that. The University of Melbourne had 107 students in science writing. BYU also in science writing. Texas A&M in CS 101. You should think of these as sort of minimum numbers because there's probably students at these institutions that are not logging in from the campus, and we wouldn't know that. So these are probably at least a minimum of the number of people that are enrolling. Well, what about Vanderbilt? I just pulled this up last night. Like, let's take a look. So there are 257 people that have logged in from Vanderbilt and another 34 from the medical center into these 47 classes. The top three were game theory, machine learning, and science writing. And then for the medical center, genome science, operations, and science writing. We could probably argue that there's more people at the medical center that need to take operations, but we'll set that aside. OK, so when do MOOC users watch videos? This is something we really haven't known until now. This is what it looks like if you just plot local time of MOOC users from all of the classes over the course of the lecture watching. So most people are watching it down here in sort of the evening and late evening hours. But there's actually quite a number of people that are watching it in the middle of the day local time, and then even some people that are watching it throughout the entire night. So we thought, well, maybe this would vary over the course of the course. So we look at the top 10, the first 10% of the videos and the last 10% of the videos, and we find very similar patterns. Nothing really looks different here. And then we look at this compare it between the students who earn a certificate and the ones that don't, seeing if there's any different pattern here. And it looks like the ones that earn a certificate are more likely to be watching it sort of in the evening hours as opposed to 3 in the morning. Then we also looked at the number of days after the video was posted in which students watched it. So the day the video was released is here at 0. So about, 7% of the students watched the video the day it's released. Jumps up to about 13% the next day, and then it slowly trails off. But you still see there's a significant number of people that are watching the video 2-3 weeks after it's been released. And the videos stay up if you've enrolled in the class basically indefinitely. So you can watch them as late as you want. You just won't get credit for the course if you don't turn in the assignments on time. Again, we look at this by the first 10%, last 10% of the videos, don't see very much variation, and students that earn a certificate not actually varying very much either. They're more likely to watch it a little bit earlier, but that should make some sense because they actually watched it when they needed to earn the certificate. OK, any questions about any of that?
Are you going to provide information on how many of the courses you compared were offered for signature track?
No, actually, we haven't broken that down by signature track. We can do that, but we haven't done that yet. That's actually worth doing. So let me make a note of that.
Have you looked at whether it varies across the different courses you were looking at? Those patterns, the last two patterns that you mentioned?
So we haven't done this across course, no. What are you thinking? You thinking that?
Some of the courses, from just looking quickly at the list, it might be that the patterns would be quite different, and getting a sense of variation would be helpful in understanding where this is going.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, it's completely worth looking at. Corbett?
Is there any way to link this when they're watching the first video to when they signed up for the class? Because I know I've signed up for class. I found out a class I was interested in.
Yeah.
3 days before it ended, so I signed up just so I could download,
Ah,
videos. So
right.
is there any way to know whether
We do know when they registered for the course,
Okay.
yes. And we actually use that as a predictor in one of the models that's coming up, although not in the way that you said. I think that's interesting to look at number of people that are registering at the end.
Because I would want to pull them from the data because clearly they've got no intention of.
Getting, right, completing it or just having, they want access to the data. Yeah, that's good suggestion. All right, so let's turn to persistence and talk about kind of what we know from this. So this is just a sample that I pulled of 13 of our classes. The big table with all of our classes is in the paper, and you can look at that. So these totals are for everybody, all 47 classes, and just pulled these out so that we can look at them. So this has the number of students that registered, and then the number of students that actually accessed the course at any time. So basically, they watched a lecture video. They had to have watched at least one lecture video or else they're not in this. And then we look at the percent that accessed, the number of certificates in the course, and then the percent of registered that earned a certificate and the percent of accessed that earned a certificate. And just to show you some of the variation. OK, so first of all, mathematical thinking had nearly 110,000 people register for the course, but only 60,000 ever actually watched a video. Okay, so you're losing huge numbers of people just right off the bat. Again, because it's so easy to just click a button and say, I'm registering for that course. And then you never watch a video again. So the percent that accessed it ranges it from a low in genome science of about 37% to a high in CS 101 of about 70%. So even the best that you're doing, you're losing about 30% of the people that register. All right, and then we could compare certificates among those registered, but that doesn't seem like a sensible thing to do, right? There's clearly at least 30% of the people in every class had no intention of getting a certificate. They didn't even watch a video. So I think looking at the certificates of conditional on accessing the course at least once is a bit better of a measure, although still has some problems. And here, again, you see huge variation. So in compilers, 3.2% of the people that ever watched a video actually got the certificate for the course. But in child nutrition, 40% did. There's something about nutrition, whether it's for a horse or a child, that seems to really encourage people to, maybe we should just add cryptography nutrition and increase participation. But the average across all the courses was just under 10% of the people that actually watched a lecture video completed the course with a certificate. So I like to call this my sort of Jackson-Pollock graph. It's kind of messy, but it basically shows the pattern of 44 courses. 3 of them had some bizarre patterns, so I didn't include them here. And what we're looking at here is basically the number of unique views on the y-axis in thousands and the lecture number. Now, different courses have different lecture numbers. Some courses have like 25 lectures. Other courses have 100 lectures. So that's why some of these end, because that's when the course ended. But you see a very similar pattern in all of these. Really large numbers of students starting, and then sort of a trailing off that sort of looks like an exponential decay. So that pattern seems pretty consistent, although there's clearly some bumpiness in all of these. So our first effort was to look at course level predictors of persistence. So this is persistence at the course level. We looked at a bunch of different outcomes. They're fairly consistent across any. Let's focus on this fourth column here, which is equivalent to that number I was telling you. This is basically the percent of students who earned a certificate conditional on watching a lecture. All right. So I think this is interesting to look at 2 things. 1, what are predictors? And 2, what aren't predictors, but that you might think are predictors? So the number of students in the class and the number of lectures in the class, and in fact, the average length of lecture video has no predictive power. There's just no association whatsoever with whether or not the course has more or less completers for any of those 3 variables. There is a negative coefficient on courses that require a prerequisite skill, but it's not significant. What is significant is a class that's a Stanford class seems to have more completers, but that could be, and my sample is completely overweighted by Stanford, and it could be that these are because of STEM courses, right? More of the STEM courses are Stanford courses, so there's a lot of collinearity there. The other thing that I think is interesting, if it's the second or more offering of the class, not the first time the class is offered, we see significantly less people completing. So trying to think why that might be. It could be that a bunch of people that enrolled the second or the third time were the people that actually went through the class the first time, and now they just want to go see if anything has changed, if maybe they missed a topic that they wanted to go back and check. I don't know. Right now, we don't have the ability to track students across multiple courses. Coursera has that, and we're trying to get permission to access it so that we can actually check that hypothesis. But this is kind of the biggest predictor in our model is if it's the second or higher offering of a class, students are less likely to actually complete. OK. So because that first graph was kind of messy, I just pulled out 9 courses to show you the lecture watching behavior persistence over each of 9 classes. In general, the patterns are very similar. They start off strong and then decay kind of in this exponential decay pattern, flatten out. But there are some real outliers here. One of the first things to notice, so in this Understanding Einstein course, the number of people that drop from the first to the second is enormous. That's like 25,000 views right there. But I want to caution you, because I've misled you a little bit, these are not unique views. So if a student went in and logged on and watched the introductory lecture 10 times, well, then that's included here as 10 watches. So instead of thinking of this as the number of students and unique views, this is actually the number of times each lecture video was accessed. OK, so that's one thing that jumps out. Another thing is that there's some really big outliers in the middle of courses here, right? So what's causing people to watch this video much, much more than the ones around it? Then you have this kind of pattern in mathematical thinking where some lectures are much more popular than others, and then 2 are not. You have strange discontinuities here in machine learning and probabilistic graphic models. So we wanted to understand all of this. All right, so our 2 ideas were, 1, let's watch unique views and see if that smooths the data. And so my next graph will replicate this, showing you just unique views. And 2, let's identify the first lecture in each week, because I think students are probably dropping off week to week. And so this graph does both of those things. The red dots are the first class of the week. And that's been smoothed because we're basically now looking at unique views. So that outlier in Einstein, no longer an outlier. That basically means tons of people were watching the first introductory video 2 or 3 times. The outliers in science writing, also gone. We looked into this. Those 2 outliers, here and here, were talking in the lecture video about the assignments. And so people watched the video. They said, oh, there's an assignment. I want to complete the assignment. I'm going to go back and watch that again. So that explains kind of where those went. And then all of the strange patterns of mathematical thinking and machine learning with these discontinuities are because of the first lecture video of the week. Although the structure is different. So in mathematical thinking, the first lecture of the week is more popular than the subsequent lectures. And then it jumps back up again for the first lecture of the week. Whereas in machine learning, it looks like there's a drop-off at the end of every week. So students are watching through the end of week 5, and then that's where they decided to stop watching, and they don't come back for week 6. And they don't come back for... So I think that's kind of what's going on here. Now we decided, well, let's look at this in a regression model and actually put in some of the predictors that we know to predict individual lecture watching. So there's, the outcome here is the percent of the class that watches any given lecture. Okay? And we model this in 2 ways. One is in a very linear way, and the second model is using an exponential decay function because it looks like that's what it follows. And if you look at the R-squared, the exponential decay function does fit the data a little bit better, but qualitatively the results are the same. So again, the length of the video has nothing to do with whether or not the students are watching it. Whether it's the first video of the week, it does seem to increase the number of students that are watching it. If it's an intro video, there's definitely more students that are watching it. If the video talks about the assignment, then students are actually less likely to watch it. And that also makes sense. If a bunch of these students are auditors, and the video is labeled as talking about an assignment, then you say, I don't need to watch that, forget it. If the video is labeled as optional, they're definitely less likely to assign it. And we found all of these sort of summary videos, assignment videos, optional videos, not by watching all 2,500 videos, but just by doing a search on the title and description of the video. It'd be great if we could do some like speech recognition and actually translate all of these and have a transcript of them, but that's well beyond the scope of what we can do at this point. Yeah.
What did you say near the beginning about evidence that the shorter videos have some positive impact?
Clearly not, right, so not, so this is sort of, I don't know of the actual paper citation here. This is just what I've heard people say, is that, and
Debbie Kohler said it when she was
exactly, right, like people say this, that shorter videos are associated with better, like, watching. Clearly, it's not related to persistence. That's right, and I think we find that quite clearly. So I think there needs to be a little bit more thought about what are the shorter videos actually accomplishing. And
Do you know what that looks like just in a bivariate relation?
No, I haven't. No, I don't. So we could look at that and explore that a little bit better. And I'll also see if there's some academic literature around this sort of length of video and paying attention.
What's the range of the videos that you're looking at here? I got these all under 12 minutes.
No, some of them are actually longer. So some of the videos are actually in 20 to 25-minute range. Some of the professors don't take this quite to heart in the same way that other professors do. And so the range is probably somewhere on the like maybe 4 to 5 minute low end up to the 20 to 25-minute high end. There aren't things that are an hour long. Maybe there actually are a couple that are an hour long, but for the most part, they're falling within the, I'd say, 6 to probably 20-minute range. But we can look at that. Okay, great. And now going back to some of this demographic data and thinking about this at the student level, we wanted to check to see if there was some difference in in the demographic information from the students that are completing versus the ones that are not completing. And again, this is not the demographic information of the completer, it's the demographic information of the area from which we have completers and non-completers. And although there's a lot of significant stars over here, it's just because our sample sizes are enormous with 350,000 observations. Practically, there's really not much of a difference here. It looks like the ones, the areas from which people earn certificates have a little bit more education relative to less than high school, but these are virtually the same. So it doesn't appear to be any difference in the demographic areas of the regions from which completers are coming and non-completers are coming. On the Understanding Einstein course. And this was also the course in which we did our experiment that I'll talk to you about momentarily. This is student-learning covariance trying to predict persistence. We looked at two outcomes. The first outcome is it ever present in week 3 or later? So basically we said, did you stick around till at least week 3? Because a lot of people drop off in those first 2 weeks. We just wanted to see if there's some association between coming in the first 2 weeks and sticking around later. And then if you ever earned a certificate. The first model is looking at some of the variables that we had available to us. So we got their email addresses, and we got whether or not they were domestic students from the IP address. And we got whether or not they registered a week or more before the course. And we can change this to 2 weeks before the course. We know their registration time. And so what we find is that registering for the course early seems to be associated with persisting until later in the course, but actually not related to earning a certificate. Our idea with these email addresses was, well, maybe those from college campuses are actually behaving differently than other students. And then maybe Gmail addresses is also signaling something about familiarity with the internet. Neither of these, I think, is all that interesting because the reference group here is anybody that didn't have an EDU or a Gmail address, and that's just everyone else. So this isn't really all that helpful. But the big thing here is completion of the pre-course survey. So if you actually complete the pre-course survey that the instructor sends out to you, you are much more likely to earn a certificate and be in the course later in the course. So this, like I said, I think is the single best predictor of any of the ones that I've seen related to actual course persistence and completion. So if you're going to teach a MOOC, you should give a pre-course survey, and then you know who the people are that are actually going to be likely to persist. And you can focus your efforts on the other ones. This pre-course survey also asked the respondents which track they wanted to follow. So this Understanding Einstein course was designed to have 3 different tracks. And basically the professor laid this out, and he explicitly told students, tell me if you're going to be an auditor and you just want to watch the lecture videos and learn. Tell me if you want to follow the quantitative track, in which you're actually going to do all these problem sets that are related to physics and understanding Einstein. Or tell me if you want to do a qualitative track, in which I'll have these assignments and assessments that are less problems-based, and you won't do a sort of final exam. You can do some final project related to Einstein that doesn't have anything to do with math. And so students actually select the ones that responded to the pre-course survey, of which I only have 1369 of them. But the ones that follow the qualitative track were less likely to be present in the course relative to the auditors, and the ones in the quantitative track much more likely to be present relative to auditors, and much more likely to earn a certificate at the end. Even though the qualitative track people could earn a certificate, the quantitative track ones did. Okay, so any questions about this sort of student level persistence? Okay, now let's turn to our experiment. So the idea behind this was we knew that these persistence patterns were really low, and we thought, well, are there some sort of behavioral psychological ideas that we could easily integrate and implement and see if we can boost persistence? So this notion of pre-commitment devices comes from psychology and behavioral economics, and the idea is that if we ask participants to pre-commit to doing something in advance, and have some penalty associated with not following through on that pre-commitment, then it's been demonstrated that people are more likely to follow through on the commitment. And there are actually a lot of papers about this in behavioral economics and psychology literature. The one that's most relevant for us is actually one in an education setting. Dan Ariely demonstrated that by asking students in a higher education course to pre-commit to turning in the assignments, they had to write 3 papers, and they asked them, you get to decide when you want to turn in the assignments. All I care about is that I get 3 papers by the time the course ends. So you all decide when you want to turn them in. Students decided to turn them in throughout the course. Clearly, the optimal economist should turn all 3 in. You should just say, I'll turn them all 3 at the end of the course, and then you can finish them earlier in your own time, and there won't be any penalty for not following through on your pre-commitment. But the penalty was you lost points in your grade if you didn't turn it in at the time that you decided to turn it in. And he showed that this actually improved performance. So there's some concept here about students saying, all right, I've committed to this. There's a penalty associated with this commitment if I don't follow through on it, so it's going to motivate me to actually do it and do a better job with it. We don't know how important this penalty is, or if it's actually just committing to it that's operationalizing these results. And so part of our study, I think, speaks to this, because the penalty for us is actually very, very low. I will point out that Dan Ariely is actually teaching his own MOOC, and I think has probably integrated 100 behavioral economics experiments into his students with it. And so I expect there to be a lot of behavioral econ experiments related to MOOCs that are coming out shortly. I wonder if he had them sign a blanket IRB consent form to just be studied with all sorts of different lab studies in these behavioral economic ideas. So what did we ask students to do? Well, so our basic research idea here is, can asking students to pre-commit to watching the first lecture video actually encourage them to watch the first lecture video? And does that subsequently lead to increased persistence? So the idea here is a lot of people are just not engaging at the beginning, right? You have that big jump of the people that registered for the course and then don't actually watch the video. So we're like, well, let's see if we can remind them of the video and actually have them watch it. That was the idea. We did this in the Understanding Einstein class. We took the first 18,000 registrants for the Understanding Einstein class, and we randomly assigned them to treatment and control groups. And the treatment group got a survey that was an online survey asked outside of the Coursera platform. They got this email through Qualtrics. And it asked them to report the day and local time that they will watch the first lecture video. So basically asks them to commit to watching the first lecture video on a specific day at a specific time of your choosing. And then we sent the control students a survey that just asked them, hey, tell us what web browser you're using to access this course. And we thought that was important because we didn't want the test and the treatment to just be a reminder of watching the course. We wanted it to actually be about the scheduling treatment and pre-committing to watching it on that time. For the second week, we asked the treatment group, so the 9,000 that were selected in the treatment group, we randomly assigned them basically the same treatment and asked them, half of them, to pick when they would watch the second video, basically the first lecture of the second week. Sorry. This is the survey that we sent them. I'm sorry, it's really small, but it basically just asks them, OK, what day are you going to watch it? And then what local time are you going to watch it in? And then it has this little note that, OK, make sure you record this on your calendar, and basically, good luck on the course. So here are the experimental results. As I mentioned earlier, we get nothing. And we have a lot of power because we have 18,000 students. So the treatment didn't have any impact on actually watching the lecture video. It has no impact on persistence, no impact on earning a certificate. We also, I should mention, blocked on these email addresses and whether or not they completed the pre-course survey, so we've included them here in the regression analysis. But basically, we just find nothing. So we thought, well, let's actually look at sort of the first stage of maybe a treatment on the treated effect and actually look at the take-up of agreeing to do this, right? How many students actually pre-committed to it? And then those that did pre-commit, let's look to see if they actually followed through on their commitment. So for the most part, they did. This is a histogram of the days before or after the day in which they pre-committed. So 0 is watching it on the day in which they pre-committed to doing it. Well, everybody did, actually. I mean, certainly there was some variation with people watching it a day or two earlier and some that watched it much later. But for the most part, people actually followed through on it. And then here are hours before and after the time at which they agreed to watch it, conditional on watching it on the day in which they agreed to watch it. And again, we see that, well, within like an hour or two, most people are watching it at the time that they said they would. So that's kind of interesting. Like, people are actually following through, or they at least kind of were able to plan and know when they would have the free time. And that seemed to work. But we didn't get any results. So part of the reason we think this might be is because there's really not much of a penalty associated with this. Like, what is the penalty? OK, you told your professor you're going to do something, and then you didn't do it. But you're in a class of 35,000 people. It's not like your professor is going to know that or even care if he did. So I think that most likely we don't find any results because of this lack of penalty. And we've been thinking through ways to replicate this and actually institute some sort of penalty. But it's unclear of how to do that. You could imagine punishing them with a course grade, but as we know, the vast majority of people don't actually care about completing the certificate, and so their course grade is somewhat irrelevant, right? If they're just going to audit the course, then who cares about what my grade is? So that probably isn't a very effective penalty. So if you have ideas on this, we're open to hearing them. Yeah, welcome.
I guess I'm kind of lost with the motivation for why we want to try to increase persistence here. I mean, I feel like, you know, we might have some general goal of wanting people to learn more,
right,
or something, but we don't want people to just learn more about everything or learn more about anything that ever piqued their interest enough to sign up for, you know, to enroll in a class online. And I feel like a lot of the, you know, a lot of what the value or the revolutionary aspect of the MOOC concept is that there's zero cost, there's no marginal cost to adding additional students.
Right.
You know, I just think, you know, the more you shift it into this idea of saying, well, once you sign up, we want to, you know, have you incur some kind of cost, increase the penalty. It's like only value there is like increasing potentially like superficial participation or cheating or something along those lines. In the same way that like in teaching, right? If you in teacher preparation programs, right? If people are just going to do a master's in teaching because they want to learn more about teaching because they care about it.
Sure.
Versus now, if you associate a pay increase with that, now, you know, there's no, you know, now people are just doing it no longer for the interest.
Sure. So I agree with a lot of what you say, and there's certainly part of what you're saying is what is the point of the educational value of these MOOCs, and are people motivated to participate in them because of human capital? Is it really all about human capital production? Is it consumption value of just learning? And I think there are a lot of good and interesting questions over that. I sort of agree with you that maybe we shouldn't be just promoting, well, everybody that registered, we should expect to watch the video. I hear where you're coming from on that point, but I actually think it's very valuable for us to learn, again, no-cost ways to increase persistence, and this is a good test of that, right? This is virtually a no-cost way of increasing some student participation in the course, and if it does work here, then we might want to think about how it applies more broadly.
I think maybe I think particularly in the absence of knowing why the person's enrolling for the course or who the person is,
right?
Then you lose some of the salience of this, right? Like if we know why you signed up for this class, if that was part of your initial survey,
right?
Where you're randomizing the people, then it might be meaningful to say, well, we want the people who signed up for this class for some particular, whether it's a human capital reason or some reason that is important.
Right.
You would want to increase their persistence.
So yeah, I mean, so exactly. So this is an initial test to see if this pre-commitment device actually works at all. If we find that some of these small behavioral economic choice nudges can actually improve things, then we can figure out where best to apply that, right? And maybe at the registration phase, that's not the best place to apply it because there's all these people that just clicked because they had a passing interest in Einstein, and this might not be the best place to apply it. But we could think about ways that it would be very useful. And so part of this is a test to understand, well, which of these mechanisms actually have some weight and can influence student behavior, and which of them don't. And so I think asking them to schedule when to watch a video without any penalty clearly doesn't have any weight, right? So that's not a worthwhile thing to continue pushing on. But because there's this literature on pre-commitment devices with penalties, I think it is worth exploring a little bit further what kind of penalty we can incorporate to see if that does have some pressure on students. And maybe you don't employ it here at this phase. You can employ it a little bit more cleverly at some other phase where persistence is actually important. But I think the first step is to see if it works.
Brent, can you just go have the results up while you're talking?
Yeah, sorry. You want this table?
No, they were great.
Yeah, OK. So there were a couple other hands. Yeah, Shatira?
Going back to the question about penalty, I don't know if this would be possible. Maybe someone can have a penalty of losing access to the rest of the videos as some penalty.
Right.
I mean, I know it's free, but maybe that's a way you can still restrict access.
So yeah, it's a good idea. I think one, Coursera probably wouldn't let us do that because it goes against their entire idea of like free education and stuff. But let's say they would. The cost of registering again is so low with another email address that there's very little we could do unless we were to block that entire IP address to do that. So it's a good idea, but I think it might be hard in practicality. Yeah, Mimi?
I wonder if you could think about a carrot instead of a stick.
So that's another option, right? Yeah. So we've thought about this in terms of generally how do you provide incentives. So let's say we wanted to provide an incentive to students to complete the pre-course survey, right? You could think about all sorts of incentives. Well, it's sort of difficult to think about how do you provide some financial incentive to people all over the globe. Do you use Bitcoin? I mean, what do you use?
I mean, financial is, you're such an economist.
I know.
Financial incentive, there could be some sort of credit. There could be, right, you can think of like less tangible incentives in terms of like interaction with the professor or
yeah, you get invited to a special like thing after with a professor. Yeah.
You can drink a beer at your computer and say that
That's
doing so.
right.
The organization
Yeah, so right.
is doing some of exactly what Mimi's saying, not so much the beer,
Yeah.
but he is identifying specific, in his screenside chats, he's identifying specific students and calling them out by name for questions, that they have posed. CNBC does that on Google Hangout. Only 8 people can be in the video. live, everybody else is, watch only mode, and it's the first people who submit questions when they're doing that actually get to be on the video, which both go to Mimi's point.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't considered something like that, but I like that. And I'll talk to Dan McFarland about what he's doing too. Okay, yeah, those are good ideas. Yes, please.
So, just looking at, it seemed like a lot of the design was kind of inspired by the Ariel experiment, right? But to me, it seems like, you mentioned that the lack of the penalty was one difference. But also, to me, it seemed like the kind of choice element was a little bit different. It reminds me of, if someone, there's this motivational theory, self-determination theory, where they say one of the kind of human motivators is autonomy, right? To express your autonomy, and then so in that first Ariela's experiment, it seems like your autonomy is increased because usually you have to turn in papers at a given date,
and now you get to choose. Yeah, right.
But the parallel in this experiment is almost flipped because you're taking away autonomy because it's not like normally you could watch the video whenever.
Right.
But now you're saying, well, we want you typically you can watch the video whenever, but now commit to watching this video at a given time. So I think for me it was kind of interesting to think about that particular lens of motivation and how we would kind of predict a different outcome.
Yeah, that's interesting. I absolutely understand what you're saying, and we'll think about that a little bit more. You're right, there could be the treatment is that you're being given an opportunity to do something that you don't usually have, and that's really what's going on with Dan's experiment.
In one, the treatment is more autonomy. The other one
Sure.
is taking it away vis-a-vis the control group.
Right. Okay. That's good. Yes?
I'm interested again in this idea about what the motivation of people to take this particular course and how that might affect what you're finding here. Because, just hearing the title, so I don't know if you know anything about the learning goals, but hearing the title, I'm like, that sounds like a course that people could just have a lot of personal interest in.
Right.
And it's not so surprising that it appeared that there were a lot of multiple views of that first video.
Sure.
It might be like, hey, this intro video on Einstein is exciting, I'm going to show my husband, and I'm going to... So I wonder if you focused on a course that had a more tight connection to people are taking this course for a real human capital reason, you might see something like that.
Right, so that's a good suggestion, and maybe do this in a computer science course where people are actually learning some skills as opposed to just trying to understand. I like that. Good thoughts. Other questions or comments about this? Thank you all, appreciate it. Yes?
One of the things you mentioned earlier was the drop-off rate between the first iteration of the course and the second iteration.
Right.
And one thing you might consider in that is the participation of the faculty member themselves. Coursera requires faculty to audit the discussion boards the first time through, but not
the second, right.
And the highest persistent rate of the Vanderbilt courses, if I'm not mistaken, was a course in which the professor did an extraordinary amount of work in the discussion forums, 40 hours a week.
Oh, wow, okay.
And so that might be a variable that you can look at.
That's great. That's not something we have considered. So we'll look at sort of the professor's interaction in the discussion. And we can also look at the professor's interaction with those email announcements. That's great. Thanks. Yeah, Courtney.
You talked about people in Buenos Aires finding other people in Buenos Aires.
Sure, right.
I wonder about that as if they're involved in a study group, if they're from their general location taking the course.
Yeah, so we can look at that if they mention wanting to do it on the discussion forums. We can see that and try to look at that as a predictor. That's a good idea. We haven't really gotten into the discussion forum data at all yet, but I like that. That's good, yeah.
I have a general question. So if in 5 years or 10 years, all courses in Coursera become credit-bearing courses, then do you think universities and colleges use these courses to add diversity in course offering or to save money by terminating some publications?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. They save money to what?
By terminating some faculty positions.
So, yeah, I mean, I think this is a fear, right? Is that somehow this is going to replace traditional higher education. And it's a good thought question. I don't think that it will replace traditional higher education. I think there will always be value associated with going to a residential college and learning. But I do think it's a way to reach more students more efficiently. And so, I don't know. I mean, it's open for discussion as to whether or not that's going to happen.
Do you think that there could be potential perverse use of this kind of research in university cases such as Georgia Tech, where they're requiring people to, and an unlimited number of students can take the class, they'll pay for it up front, and if they don't complete the credit, they have to take it again by paying up front again. I mean, in your, and I've not looked into MOOCs or like where they're going or anything, but is there any sense that the universities would avoid that, or the idea would be like that could just make it an even bigger cash cow? Is that?
But how is that different from traditional higher ed now in community colleges with remediation?
Things that like try to depress course completion and persistence so that students have to take it over?
I don't think they have to do that. I think that just is.
It just happens. Yeah, I mean, sure, I guess they could do that. I think most universities see themselves as trying to help students learn, and so that goes against their entire mission. So I guess it could produce perverse incentives, but I don't think we see institutions intentionally trying to fail students so that they'll come back and retake courses. I think they're doing, and that happens, absolutely, Mimi's right, but they're trying to make efforts to at least mitigate it. They're sometimes not successful at it. There are ways that we could consider holding institutions more accountable, and the ways that the federal government are doing that now is by advertising graduation rates more widely, so that institutions actually have incentive to produce higher graduation rates, because there's some fear that if a student sees that, oh, if I go to this college, then my chance of graduation is much lower. The other way they do it is by punishing them by denying them Title IV funds if they have high default rates, so for the student loans. So there's a couple ways and mechanisms that the government is doing to try to ensure that institutions focus on improving graduation rates. And yeah, maybe this MOOC idea can fall into that discussion. Well, it remains to be seen. Yes?
It seems like it would be helpful to have a way to quantify kind of the difficulty of each course.
Yeah.
I'm currently kind of addicted to Coursera, and I'm enrolled in 3 right now. And I'm actually trying to complete all 3, but like one of them I definitely had to give up because I was like, oh, that's way too much work.
Sure.
Too many, quizzes and midterm and then final versus another. I have a weekly quiz, maybe 30 minutes tops of 7 lectures.
So it would be very easy to quantify the sort of amount of work, but the difficulty level of the work, I think, would be a little bit more challenging.
Assignments, maybe a point range or something assigned to the course, and kind of distribution across the weeks.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's something we can look into when we start exploring the quiz and assignment data a little bit more. I have also sat in on MOOCs that I'm like, okay, this is way too advanced for me, right? I don't know what's going on here because it's at a higher level of computer science than what I have. It's really interesting to think about why are these students dropping out, right? So it's interesting to think about why are students enrolling for it initially, and there is a little bit of survey data that I'm not have access to right now that answers that question for the respondents of the survey, which again is kind of low. And then why are students leaving it? So anecdotally, when we ask students why they're leaving it because it was just bad, right? The course was a bad course, and people drop out of bad courses. It was too challenging, it didn't meet their expectations, or they just got busy. And I think that's what we saw with a lot of the disengagers, right? If you're engaged for 4 weeks, doing everything, and then suddenly you can stop out because it's an easy thing to drop off of your schedule. But more work needs to be done in that area, and that's going to just continue to come through building surveys and trying to increase response rates on those. Yeah, Jonathan.
Is there anything about, I know you have like times and stuff for when they take, is there anything about when during the year they take the courses? I'm just wondering if like persistence is higher over the summer, for example, if a lot of students are taking the courses and they have more free time, or if like during mid or end of semester, right, you might see that like turns out that in mid-October and early December, like tons of people
drop.
courses.
Right.
As opposed to one that starts in September and ends at the end
Yeah,
of October.
yeah, exactly.
Right. So we haven't looked explicitly at that. We do look at, in the course level persistence table, we look at sort of when the course started in like a general time frame. So the earliest courses are sort of Daphne and Andrew's original courses at Coursera, and databases and HCI and that sort of stuff. And then the courses that come later. And there is actually more persistence in the courses that came later, just slightly, but and marginally significant. But we haven't actually looked at the time of year, and that could be correlated with when people are busy. That's a good suggestion. Yeah.
Do some of these courses have a gamification aspect to them? So like, do they have sort of a leadership board and scoring board? Because there have been studies that found that if you assign scores to them,
Yeah.
the number of comments they make or things like that, they will be more inclined to participate in
Right.
the course.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, one of the courses that's in our data is gamification. It's actually a course offered by the University of Pennsylvania on this exact topic. Coursera doesn't do a lot of it. Actually, some of the other platforms do much, much more of it in terms of like giving you trophies and kind of keep starring you for being a good discussant. Coursera doesn't do much of that. And so that I don't think is a big element of these courses. But if we get some data on other platforms, we would be able to examine that a little bit more. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that has been shown to really increase participation. I've seen really interesting platforms for secondary education students where they're like online tutors and they get to answer questions, and the more questions they answer, sort of the more their rating goes up. That seems to encourage participation quite a lot.
Brent,
Yes.
Coursera, I know, does not encourage or have any way of assessing collaborative work except maybe peer assessments, right?
There's definitely peer assessments, yes, in some courses,
So I
yeah.
was wondering if there is a way you can have a pre-commitment to do some kind of that work, where there's a collaborative aspect to the courses that they might actually see, where you get comments from other students that are positive, and that might be a motivator to actually do more work. Even, I don't know whether it's going to improve completion rates, but it's going to take them farther along the course than others.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It's something we haven't considered. We can definitely look into that. Yeah, Justin?
Do you have age information in your demographic?
Age information?
No.
No, I mean, we literally know nothing about the actual students,
Yeah, I'm just
right?
thinking of, because you've done the community, kind of the racial.
Right, we could do the age of the community. Is that,
I'm
yeah.
curious if it's not students that are taking this during summer,
Yeah.
but it's, education is entertainment. It's people that listen to NPR and TED Talks and Discovery Channel and history.
Yep.
It's a different demographic profile than possibly a college level.
Yeah, I think that's something we should look at. And definitely anecdotally, a lot of people are retired people that are like, oh, this looks like an interesting thing. I'll go spend some time doing that. Yeah, so that's good. We should put that in there.
From the Great Works or whatever that paid video lecture series is.
Right.
A friend of mine at Clemson decided to take a Coursera course, I think it was Coursera, on algebra. She said, now I understand it. I said, you're a PhD in sociology. What are you doing?
Yes.
Yes, you go back to the non-terminal results just as a background.
So which one do you want? So the student level ones or the course level? Okay. That's here. Yeah. Sure. Yes.
One of the other things, I don't know if he was doing this, because I saw you had the class in there, but McFarland's organizational
Yep.
analysis class, what he's doing at least this semester is 2 versions of all the videos. One with the video inset of him,
Right.
and one without.
Right,
To
yeah.
see if it improves persistence.
Right.
If you can actually see the professor. So.
Yep. No, exactly. And Dan's been toying a lot around with this. Yeah. So that'll be interesting to see. There are a lot of, there's been a lot of thoughts and experimentation going on sort of within individual courses. And so hopefully we'll start seeing some results of those that are compiled in some way. I haven't been able to do that yet. Did you have a question about the table you wanted to talk about, or a point?
I was looking at the number of lectures. See if that's on there.
Oh, so the number of lectures is on the next one here. This is the lecture level. Is that what you're looking for? Oh, you're saying at the course level,
Right.
the number of lectures that are offered.
It looked like there was some difference in the watch and also in the graphs. Like the machine learning looked like there were 10 lectures a week, and that was of course where there was a drop off, and then in the science writing where there were fewer lectures, you had more of the weekly peak.
Right, yeah, no, we were exactly interested in this because there's only 25 lectures in mathematical thinking for the entire course, and then in Einstein there's, like 3 times that. But it doesn't look like that predicts anything that we found. So just some final thoughts, some things that we were thinking of pushing forward on this. So I think the exploring the assignments and the quiz, and I'll toss in the discussion forum data there, trying to access data from across multiple courses and track students that have participated in one course and see how often they appear. And if the persisters are the persisters that are the same people in all of these courses that are like accumulating certificates, trying to get access to edX data to do cross-platform comparisons and more sort of cross-institutional analyses. If I can get the Vanderbilt data, that'll help there. Yep, Tom?
Do you have a sense why Coursera and the others don't ask during registration if the person intends to earn a certificate? It seems like a big thing you'd want to compare against.
Yeah, so I think their philosophy about this was let's just make it open and access to everybody and put up as few impediments as possible. And so their philosophy to this was if we start asking questions when students register, it will deter students from registering. I think that's their thought process on it. I don't necessarily agree with it, and I think asking a few questions is unlikely to deter someone from enrolling as long as they're fairly innocuous questions. But it hasn't happened yet. So there's been this sort of movement to try to offer this pre-course survey that would ask questions like that across all of the MOOCs. But the problem is because it's just asked to all the registrants, we get a low response rate, and it has nothing to do with their initial enrolling in Coursera. So it's not ideal, and I think we need to do a better job of thinking about how to capture that data. There are also other people that I'll talk to that think we should just throw out everything that I'm thinking about because we're applying these traditional concepts of higher education to something that is exactly not traditional higher education. And I think that might be worth discussing, but we need a new framework to think about how we discuss student success in this context. And we haven't really developed that yet.
It comes back to kind of how you identify learning.
Right.
In the context of it. I mean, do you think that somebody learns from watching
a video?
Or
right.
Is it important to have some kind of sustained and interactive
interaction? Right. And I don't know how to answer that question. Yeah, but it is a good one. Any other final thoughts?
I was going to ask you about the quizzes, but you say that you're going to explore that.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that at all yet, and I think that's on our to-do list. One of the 3 or 4 papers later down the road that we'll try to pull out of this. So it is. It's too much data to look at. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah.